The storm hit the colony 3 days before anything strange happened. Rain fell in heavy sheets over the metal rooftops, and thunder rolled across the valley like something waking up underground. Nobody thought much about the storm until the next morning, when a farmer named Dale walked out to check his fences and found a nest of large cracked shells scattered near the tree line. Most of the eggs were broken beyond saving. Only one had survived, and it was already hatching. The colony had been built on this world for almost 10 years. Humans lived here alongside the Drathek, a species that looked like something out of an old fairy tale, tall, scaled, with wings folded against their backs and eyes like burning coals. The Drathek were not enemies, not exactly. There was a treaty, there was trade, but there was also fear, the kind that never really goes away, the kind that sits quietly under polite conversations and comes out the moment something goes wrong. And something had gone wrong. The last surviving egg belonged to a Drathek clutch, and when it hatched, the creature inside did not come out gentle. It came out already fighting. Dale called it into the colony office, and within the hour, a small crowd had gathered outside a maintenance shed at the edge of town, where the hatchling had been moved for safety. It was the size of a large dog, covered in dark red scales that had not yet hardened, with wings too small to be useful and claws that were already sharp. It hissed at anyone who came near. When a Drathek elder named Orin approached to examine it, the hatchling snapped at his hand and drew blood. "It is broken," Orin said, wrapping a cloth around his fingers. "Its mind came out wrong. This happens sometimes when a clutch dies around it. The fear gets into the shell." The colony administrator, a tired woman named Bate, who had spent the last decade trying to keep humans and Drathek from killing each other over misunderstandings, rubbed her temples and asked the question nobody wanted to answer. What do we do with it? Orin did not answer right away. Among his people, there were old stories about hatchlings that came out wrong, creatures that never trusted, never bonded, and eventually turned dangerous as they grew. The safest thing, the old stories said, was to end it before it could hurt anyone. Orin did not like the idea, but he also did not have a better one. "We should discuss it tomorrow," he said finally. "Tonight, just keep it contained." The shed was locked, and guards were posted outside, more out of habit than real concern, since nobody expected a half-grown hatchling to break out of anything. Inside, the creature paced in circles, banging against the walls, snapping at shadows. It had lost its whole clutch in a single storm. It did not understand what a treaty was, or a colony, or a species. It only understood that it was alone, and that everything around it was a threat. That evening, while the adults argued in the town hall about what should be done, a boy named Ollie slipped away from his parents. He was 7 years old, small for his age, with a gap in his front teeth and a habit of wandering off that drove his mother half crazy. He had heard the guards talking about a monster in the shed, and being 7, he did not hear the word monster the way an adult would. He heard it the way children hear most things, as an invitation. Nobody was watching the shed closely. The guards had drifted toward the town hall to listen to the arguing, curious, like everyone else, about what the colony would decide. Ollie found the shed door with a warning sign painted across it in red letters he could not fully read yet. He pushed the door open anyway. Inside, the hatchling froze the moment the light spilled in. It backed into a corner, wings pressed flat, throat rumbling with a low warning sound. Ollie stood very still in the doorway, the way his father had taught him to stand still around the barn animals when they got spooked. "Hey," he said quietly, "it's okay." The hatchling did not think it was okay. It bared its teeth, small but sharp, and the sound coming from its chest grew louder. Anyone older, anyone who understood how much damage a young Drathek's claws could do, would have stepped back immediately. Ollie did not step back. He crouched down instead, making himself smaller, the way he did when the neighbor's dog got nervous around new people. "You're scared," Ollie said. It wasn't a question. He said it the same simple way he said most things, without dressing it up. "I get scared too. Storms are loud." The hatchling's growl faltered, just slightly, confused by the calm voice, instead of the shouting and banging it had heard all day. It did not move closer, but it did not lunge either. It watched him with wide, dark eyes that still had a strange golden ring around the edges, a mark of the Drathek bloodline nobody in that shed understood yet. Ollie reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of bread he had been saving from dinner, the the kind of thing a boy keeps around out of habit rather than hunger. He set it down on the floor between them and did not push it any further. Then he sat down cross-legged, right there on the dusty floor, well within reach of claws that could have opened his arm to the bone. Outside, the storm clouds from 3 nights ago had finally cleared, and a thin strip of moonlight came through a gap in the shed's roof, falling across the hatchling scales and the boys' scraped knees. Neither of them moved for a long moment. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before something changes, though neither the boy nor the creature knew that yet. They only knew that, for the first time since the storm, something in the small shed had stopped being quite so afraid. Guard duty at the shed was supposed to be the easiest job in the colony that night. A young officer named Reyes had drawn the short straw and was told to stand outside a locked door and make sure a scared, half-grown lizard did not chew through the wall. He had been leaning against the fence, half asleep, when he heard a voice coming from inside the shed that should have been empty except for the hatchling. He unlocked the door fast, expecting the worst, expecting blood. What he found instead made him stop in the doorway with his hand still on his sidearm, not sure what to do with what he was seeing. Ollie was sitting on the floor with his arms wrapped around the hatchling's neck, hugging it the way he hugged his mother when she came home from long shifts at the water plant. The hatchling was not pulling away. It was not snapping or hissing. It sat there stiffly, wings half spread, letting the small boy hold onto it like it did not quite know what else to do. "You're cute," Ollie said again, mostly to himself, patting the creature's scaled neck the way he'd pat a large dog. "You don't have to be scared anymore. I'm here." Reyes did not move for several seconds. He had been briefed on the danger, the claws, the temperament, all of it. None of it matched what he was looking at now. He raised his wrist communicator with a shaking hand and called it in, keeping his voice low so he would not startle either of them. Within 20 minutes, half the colony seemed to know. Bait arrived first, out of breath, followed closely by Ollie's parents, a quiet farmhand named Grace and her husband Marcus. No, wait, that name could not be used, so instead he would simply be called Tom's father in later mentions, or simply the boy's father, actually best to just call him by first name, established fresh. His father, a machinist named Hal, arrived pale and furious, ready to pull his son out by the collar. But when Hal reached the doorway and saw his son curled against the hatchling's side, both of them breathing slow and calm, he stopped in his tracks the same way Reyes had. "Ollie," Hal said carefully, "come here, slowly." Ollie looked up, confused by the tone in his father's voice. "Dad, look, it's not a monster, it was just scared." He turned back to the hatchling and rubbed a spot behind its jaw, and the creature made a low sound, almost like a rumble of contentment, that nobody in that shed had ever heard a Drathek hatchling make before. Orin arrived a few minutes later, summoned from the town hall meeting where the argument about the hatchling's fate had still been going in circles. He pushed through the small crowd gathering outside the shed and stopped cold when he saw the scene inside. His people had stories about hatchlings like this one, stories that always ended badly. What he was looking at did not match any of those stories. "Get the boy out of there," Orin said, his voice sharp with old fear. "Now." Hal took a careful step forward, but the hatchling's head snapped up, and a low growl rumbled from its chest, aimed not at Ollie, but at the adults crowding the doorway. It shifted its body slightly, placing itself between the boy and the people gathered outside, wings flaring just enough to look larger than it actually was. "It's protecting him," Reyes said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Ollie, seemingly unbothered by all the tension in the room, patted the hatchling's side again. It's okay, these are my people, they're not gonna hurt you." He looked at his father with the simple, stubborn honesty only a 7-year-old could manage. "He's not a monster, Dad, he's just lonely. His whole family got broken in the storm." Hal glanced at Orin, unsure what to do with a creature that everyone had spent the last 24 hours calling dangerous, now curled protectively around his son like it had appointed itself a bodyguard. Bait, ever the administrator even in strange situations, stepped forward slowly, hands raised, palms open. "Nobody is going to hurt the boy," she said, addressing the hatchling directly, which felt strange even as she did it. "We just want him to come out safely. Can you let him go?" The hatchling watched her for a long moment, gold-ringed eyes studying the room full of tense adults, before finally lowering its head and easing back just slightly, enough space for Ollie to stand up and walk toward his father without the creature lunging or panicking. But the moment Ollie stepped away, the hatchling's calm cracked. It let out a sharp, distressed cry and pressed itself against the back wall of the shed, wings wrapping around its own body the way it had done the first night, alone and frightened all over again. Ollie stopped walking. "He's scared again," Ollie said, turning around. "Dad, he's scared." Nobody in that shed had an easy answer for what came next. The colony had a hatchling that everyone believed was dangerous, a boy who clearly did not agree, and a decision still waiting to be made in the town hall about whether the creature would even be allowed to live past the week. For the first time, though, that decision did not feel simple anymore. Orin stood in the doorway a long time, watching the hatchling watch the boy, and for the first time since the storm, he was no longer certain the old stories were telling the whole truth. Word traveled fast in a colony this small, and by the next morning, almost everyone had heard some version of what happened in the shed. Some versions made Ollie sound brave, some made him sound reckless. A few of the older Drathek who heard the story shook their heads and said the boy was lucky to still have both arms. But none of that stopped Ollie from waking up before sunrise and asking his mother, Grace, if he could go see the hatchling again. "Absolutely not," Grace said, pouring water into a pot for the morning meal without looking up. "That thing could have hurt you, Ollie. Do you understand that?" "He wouldn't hurt me," Ollie said, in the flat, certain tone kids use when they have already decided something is true. "He was just scared. Everybody keeps calling him a monster, and nobody even asked him." Grace exchanged a tired look with Hal, who had barely slept after the events of the previous night. They were not wrong to worry. The Drathek elders had spent the whole meeting arguing about what to do with a hatchling that, in their eyes, might be dangerously unstable. Some wanted it removed from the colony entirely. A few wanted it destroyed before it grew large enough to be a real threat. Only Orin had argued for waiting, and even he was not fully convinced. But something had changed overnight, and it wasn't just Ollie's stubbornness. The colony's veterinary researcher, a calm and thorough woman named Priya, had gone to examine the hatchling early that morning and found it in worse shape than before, refusing food, packing in tight circles, its scales dull instead of bright. She reported to Bate that the creature was showing every sign of severe distress, the kind that came from real fear and loneliness rather than any defect in its blood. "It's not aggressive because it's broken," Priya explained later that day, standing in Bates' office with a datapad full of notes. "It's aggressive because it's terrified and it has no one. In the wild, Drathek hatchlings bond with a parent or sibling within the first few days. This one lost its whole clutch. It has nothing to attach to." "Except the boy," Bates said slowly. "Except the boy," Priya agreed. It was not a decision anyone made easily, but by that afternoon, Bate had arranged something nobody expected, a short, closely supervised visit, with Ollie allowed back into the shed under the watch of Priya, Rays, and a very nervous Orin standing just outside the door with his arms crossed. Hal and Grace stood nearby too, ready to pull their son out at the first sign of trouble. The moment Ollie stepped through the door, the change in the hatchling was immediate. Its head lifted, ears, or the small ridges where ears would be, perked forward, and the low, distressed packing stopped completely. It moved toward him carefully, sniffing at his outstretched hand before pressing its head against his palm. "See," Ollie said, grinning at the adults crowded in the doorway. "He remembers me." Over the following 2 weeks, the visits became a regular part of the colony's routine, though never without careful supervision. Ollie gave the hatchling a name, Rook, because it reminded him of a picture in one of his books, a big black bird that watched over its nest. Rook responded to the name almost immediately, turning his head whenever Ollie said it, which surprised even Priya, who had not expected such quick recognition from a creature still barely past hatching. The bond grew in small, ordinary ways. Ollie taught Rook to chase a ball made from an old cloth sack, which Rook eventually learned to bring back, dropping it at the boy's feet with something close to pride. Rook learned the sound of Ollie's footsteps outside the shed and would scratch eagerly at the door before anyone even knocked. When Ollie sat and did his schoolwork nearby, Rook would curl up beside him and simply watch, calm in a way none of the guards or researchers had seen from him before. Not everyone in the colony was happy about the arrangement. Some parents did not want their children anywhere near the shed, worried that what worked for one boy would not work for others. A few Drathek elders, including some who had never even seen the hatchling, sent messages questioning why a wild, unstable creature was being allowed to bond with a human child instead of being handled by trained Drathek caretakers. Orin found himself caught in the middle, defending a decision he was still not fully sure of himself, while also quietly amazed each time he watched Rook settle instantly the moment Ollie walked through the door. In all my years, Orin admitted to Bait one evening, watching through the shed's small window as Ollie read aloud from a picture book while Rook lay curled around him like a warm blanket. I have never seen a hatchling calm this fast or trust this completely. Perhaps the old stories missed something. Or perhaps, Bates said, the stories were written by people who never had a 7-year-old walk into the room. Neither of them had an answer for what would happen when Rook grew larger, stronger, and harder to control by anyone but a small boy who barely came up to his shoulder. But for now, in the quiet of the shed each evening, none of that mattered. There was only a boy and a dragon who had decided, against every warning and every old story, to trust each other completely. Priya had been running tests on Rook for almost a month before she found something that made her sit back in her chair and read the results twice, just to be sure she wasn't imagining things. She had been collecting small samples during routine checkups, mostly to track Rook's growth and general health, but a deeper scan of his blood markers revealed something she had not expected at all. She brought the results to Orin first, since it involved his people more than anyone else in the colony. He read through the data slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to disbelief. "This cannot be right," he said, tapping the screen. "Run it again." "I already ran it 3 times, Priya said. "The markers are consistent. Whatever this bloodline is, it's rare, extremely rare." According to the readings, Rook was not simply a hatchling who had been traumatized by losing his clutch. His genetic markers matched something Orin's people called the emberline, an old and nearly extinct Drathek bloodline known for unusually strong bonding instincts and sharp intelligence, far beyond a typical hatchling. Generations ago, emberline dragons had been prized among the Drathek, chosen companions for elders and leaders, valued for their loyalty and insight. But over time, superstition had turned against them. Old stories claimed emberline hatchlings that failed to bond quickly with their own kind were cursed, doomed to grow violent and unstable. Those stories had led, over centuries, to the bloodline being quietly wiped out, hatchlings culled before they could grow, until almost none were left. "You're telling me," Orin said slowly, sitting down heavily on a bench outside the shed, "that the creature everyone wanted to destroy is one of the last of a bloodline my own people used to treasure." "I'm telling you," Priya said, "that the aggression everyone saw in the first few days wasn't a defect, it was grief. Emberline hatchlings bond harder and faster than normal Drathek, which means losing a clutch would hit one of them much worse. Rook wasn't dangerous, he was heartbroken." Word of the discovery did not stay quiet for long. Within days, a group of Drathek elders from a neighboring settlement arrived at the colony, having heard the news through old contacts. They were polite, formal, and completely unwilling to leave without at least discussing the matter of reclaiming the last known emberline hatchling for proper Drathek upbringing. One elder in particular, a stern, older Drathek named Vashta, made it clear she believed the bloodline was too important to be left in human hands, no matter how well Rook seemed to be doing. "He belongs with his own kind," Vashta said during a tense meeting in the town hall, her voice carrying easily through the room. "A creature of his bloodline requires proper training, discipline passed down through generations. What can a human child possibly teach him?" Bait, sitting across the table, kept her voice calm even as the room grew tense around her. "With respect, your own people were prepared to destroy him a month ago. It was a human child who kept him alive long enough for anyone to discover what he actually is." The argument stretched over several days, pulling in colony officials, Drathek representatives, and even distant voices from further Drathek settlements who had opinions about a hatchling they had never seen. Ollie, for his part, understood very little of the politics swirling around him, only that strangers kept talking about taking Rook away, and that thought alone was enough to make him quietly furious in the stubborn way only children can manage. "They can't just take him," Ollie told his father one night, sitting at the kitchen table with his arms crossed tightly. "He's my friend. He'd be scared without me." Hal did not have an easy answer. He had watched, over the past month, as his son formed a bond with a creature that half the colony still didn't fully trust, and he understood now that trying to explain politics to a 7-year-old rarely worked the way adults hoped. Instead, he simply said, "We're not going to let anyone hurt him or take him somewhere he doesn't want to go. But you have to understand, Ollie, some of this is bigger than just you and Rook." Meanwhile, at the shed, Rook had grown noticeably in the weeks since his hatching, his wings stronger, his claws sharper, his body filling out with a strength that made even Ray's nervous during checkups now. But whenever Vashta or the visiting elders came near, Rook's calm, easy manner vanished entirely. He would growl low in his throat, pressing his body toward whichever direction Ollie stood, refusing to let the strangers get close, no matter how carefully they approached. "He does not trust us," Vashta admitted reluctantly after one failed attempt to examine him herself. "Perhaps the human boy has some use after all." It was Priya who finally suggested the idea that shifted the entire argument. Instead of removing Rook from the colony or forcing him to bond with unfamiliar Drathek caretakers against his will, why not allow both human and Drathek elders working together, with Ollie remaining part of Rook's life rather than being pushed out of it? It was not a perfect solution, and it satisfied no one completely, which Bate privately thought was usually a sign of a fair compromise. Vashta was not pleased, but even she could not deny what her own eyes had shown her again and again. Rook trusted the boy in a way he trusted no one else, bloodline or not. The debate was far from settled, but for the first time, everyone in that room agreed on one thing. Whatever Rook was, wherever his bloodline had come from, the boy who had walked fearlessly into a locked shed a month ago had somehow become the one thing holding the whole fragile situation together. The attack came on a quiet evening, the kind where nothing in the colony seemed unusual until it was already too late to stop what was coming. Ships had been spotted on the outer scanners 3 days earlier, unregistered and moving with no clear flight pattern, but the colony's small defense team had written it off as smugglers passing through, the way they sometimes did along this stretch of the frontier. Nobody guessed those ships were circling back, gathering information, waiting for the right moment. The moment came just after sunset, when most of the colony was indoors for the evening meal. Alarms cut through the quiet all at once, sharp and sudden, followed by the low roar of engines descending too fast and too close. 3 unmarked ships broke through the colony's outer defenses before anyone could properly respond, landing in a wide, dusty clearing not far from the maintenance shed where Rook had spent most of his life so far. The raiders who spilled out of those ships were not interested in the colony's supplies or its people, not directly. Word had reached far corners of the frontier about a rare emberline hatchling being raised near a small human settlement, and rare things, especially living ones, fetched a high price among certain buyers who did not care how they were obtained. A dozen armed figures moved quickly and with clear purpose, heading straight for the shed with tools meant for capture rather than combat. Reyes was on duty that night, and he barely had time to draw his weapon before 2 of the raiders knocked him aside and forced open the shed door. Rook, now nearly the size of a large horse, reared back with a furious roar the moment strangers burst into his space, wings flaring wide, claws raking through the air. He was stronger now than he had been weeks ago, but he was still young, still untrained in real combat, and the raiders had brought heavy nets and stun equipment built exactly for capturing creatures like him. Across the colony, chaos spread fast. Families rushed for shelter, defense volunteers grabbed whatever weapons they had, and Bates' voice crackled urgently over every available channel, trying to organize a response before the raiders could finish what they came for. Hal grabbed Grace's arm the moment the alarms sounded, both of them running not toward shelter, but toward the one place they knew their son would already be heading. They were right. Ollie had been eating dinner when the alarms went off, and the second he heard shouting mention Rook's name near the shed, He bolted out the door before either parent could stop him, ignoring every shouted warning behind him. By the time Ollie reached the clearing, Rook was fighting hard against two raiders trying to pin a net over his wings, snapping and thrashing with a wild desperation that came from real fear rather than any trained skill. A third raider raised a stun weapon, aiming carefully at Rook's exposed side. Rook, Ollie's voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear despite how small he was against the chaos around him. Rook's head snapped toward the sound instantly, distracted just enough that the net slipped from the raider's grip. But that distraction also gave the raider with the stun weapon a clear shot, and he fired without hesitation. The bolt struck Rook's shoulder, and he let out a pained cry, stumbling but not falling, his body shaking as he fought against the effects. Ollie did not stop running. He pushed past a startled defense volunteer trying to grab him and skidded to a stop directly between Rook and the advancing raiders, arms spread wide, small and completely unafraid in a way that made even the armed strangers hesitate for half a second. "Leave him alone," Ollie shouted, his voice cracking but steady. That half-second hesitation was enough. Rook, still shaking off the effects of the stun bolt, surged forward with a burst of protective fury unlike anything he had shown before, placing himself fully between Ollie and the raiders despite the pain clearly radiating through his body. His roar this time was not panicked. It was a warning, deep and furious, the sound of something choosing to fight rather than flee. Ray's, bloodied but on his feet again, rallied nearby defenders toward the clearing, and within moments, the colony's scattered but determined resistance began pushing back against the raiders. Orin arrived soon after, moving faster than his age usually allowed, joined by two other Drathek who had been visiting the settlement and threw themselves into the fight the moment they understood what the raiders had come for. Ollie, still standing close to Rook despite his parents finally reaching the clearing and trying desperately to pull him back, found himself doing something no one expected. He understood Rook's instincts better than anyone in that fight, having spent weeks learning his moods, his warning signs, the subtle shifts before he moved. When Rook tensed toward one side, Ollie shouted a warning to the defenders nearby. When Rook's wings flared in a certain way, Ollie called out that he was about to charge, giving the colony's fighters just enough time to clear a path or brace themselves. "He's going to hit the one on the left," Ollie yelled at exactly the right moment, and Ray's ducked aside just as Rook's shoulder slammed into a raider trying to flank him, sending the man sprawling into the dust. The fight did not last much longer after that. Outnumbered, injured, and facing a hatchling far more dangerous than their intelligence had suggested, the remaining raiders retreated toward their ships, dragging their wounded with them, leaving behind scattered equipment and a colony left shaking but standing. Rook, exhausted and still favoring his stunned shoulder, sank down onto the dusty ground the moment the last ship lifted off, and Ollie was at his side instantly, arms wrapped around his neck, the same way they had been that very first night in the shed. "You're okay," Ollie whispered, tears streaking through the dust on his face. "You're okay, you did it." Around them, the colony slowly gathered, breathless and stunned, staring at the boy and the dragon who had, between them, held the line against something none of them had been ready for. Whatever doubts had lingered about Rook's place in the colony, about whether he was truly dangerous or truly safe, were harder to hold on to now, standing in a clearing that Rook himself had fought to protect. Repairs took most of a week, though the damage from the raid had been smaller than it could have been, thanks in large part to the fight in the clearing. Broken fences were rebuilt, a few damaged buildings patched up, and the colony slowly settled back into its usual rhythm. But something had shifted in the days since the attack, something that no repair crew could measure or fix because it wasn't broken to begin with. It was the way people looked at Rook now, walking through the colony paths beside Ollie instead of locked away in a shed at the edge of town. Vashta, who had argued so firmly weeks earlier that Rook belonged elsewhere, was among the first to change her tone, though she did it in her own careful, formal way. She arrived at the colony a few days after the attack, watched Rook rest peacefully in the shade of a storage building with Ollie curled against his side reading aloud from a book, and stood there a long while before finally speaking. "I misjudged him," she admitted to Oren, who stood beside her. "I misjudged them both." Oren, who had spent the last month slowly setting aside old fears he had carried his whole life, nodded slowly. The stories our people tell about the emberline were written by those who feared what they didn't understand. Perhaps it is time new stories were written instead. The colony held a small gathering not long after, nothing grand, just a shared meal outdoors with tables pulled together and lanterns strung along the fence posts. Bates stood before the gathered crowd, humans and Drathek together, and made the announcement that had taken weeks of careful negotiation to reach. Rook would remain in the colony, recognized formally not as a captured creature or a diplomatic prize to be fought over, but as a protected companion, free to grow and live among the people who had already proven, in the worst possible way, that they were willing to stand and fight for him. Ollie, sitting cross-legged near Rook's side during the announcement, did not fully understand all the formal words being used, the treaties and agreements Bate read aloud. He understood only the simple part underneath it all, the part that mattered most to him. "That means you get to stay," he whispered to Rook, resting his head against the dragon's scaled shoulder. Rook rumbled low in his chest, a sound Priya had once told them meant contentment, and pressed closer to the boy as if he understood perfectly well what staying meant. Not every difficulty vanished overnight. Rook continued to grow larger by the month, and there would be new challenges ahead about training, about space, about what it meant for a colony this size to raise a creature that would one day be far bigger and stronger than any human or even any full-grown Drathek. But those were problems for later, problems the colony would face together instead of arguing over from opposite sides of a fence. Years passed quietly after that, the way they tend to once the dramatic parts of a story settle into ordinary life. Ollie grew taller, losing the gap in his front teeth, trading picture books for real ones, though he never stopped visiting Rook every single day without fail. Rook grew too, taller than any building in the colony, wings strong enough to carry him for miles, though he never once used that strength against the people who had taken him in. Children who had once been warned to stay away from the shed now grew up thinking of Rook as simply part of the colony, as normal as the fences or the water tower, a great red shape often seen resting in the fields with a boy, now nearly grown himself, sitting nearby. On quiet evenings, new colonists arriving from other settlements sometimes asked about the enormous dragon they saw wandering freely near the town square, clearly startled by the sight. The old-timers would usually just smile and tell them the story, the same one that had, by then, been told so many times it had become something close to legend around the colony's fires. They told newcomers about a storm and a broken clutch, and a hatchling everyone had been ready to give up on. They told them about a boy who walked into a locked shed against every warning, who sat down in front of something everyone called a monster, and who said the only thing that ever seemed to matter in the end. Ollie, now a young man who still preferred simple words over fancy ones, sometimes overheard these retellings while walking past with Rook beside him, and he would just shake his head, faintly embarrassed by how much bigger the story had grown in the telling. To him, it had never felt complicated. He had never needed elders' warnings or old bloodline stories to know what he was looking at that first night in the shed. He had simply seen something scared and alone, and had done the only thing that made sense to a 7-year-old boy with no fear left in him for things that only looked frightening on the outside. He had knelt down, looked past the claws and the sharp teeth and the trembling growl, and told the truth as plainly as he knew how. "You're cute," he had said, and somehow, against every warning and every old fear the colony carried, that one small, simple truth had been enough to change everything.